in that sense, legitimacy is a process, also to be studied as a process and to be studied from different perspectives. Dr. Hossain, we're on the topic of the already quite full agenda of the Institute, I think quite fruitfully in the Netherlands, also in looking at the right to water as a central concern also of the Dutch state. In looking at the Institute's agenda, from your academic and your practical experience, do you have issues where you say, well, it's absolutely crucial to use all the knowledge that there is here in The Hague on that particular topic, because that's where global justice should be concretized in the years to come?
Right, but I think already we've mentioned the role of law now must address those things which touch people's legitimate expectations. Mm-hmm. You know, if you hear the voices of people and say, what do you consider to be your basic entitlements and expectations, you will find people will articulate that, will tell you that. But then it is for those who devise a strategy of how their expectations can be realized through conscious policies, through community action, through people responding in a constructive way to those challenges. Now, you know, we have in the past, the population resources ratio had been more favorable than it will be as we move on. The population in the world is continuing to increase. Before we know it, will be 8 billion people in the world, and with the same resources and the same land and the same water. Mm-hmm. So as Madam Secretary says, not only is oil expected to deplete, hydrocarbons are expected to deplete by the middle of the century, but water is going to be, the projection is that water may be the source of conflict and tremendous competing claims being made. And this is where, of course, the other important thing which I think we should keep in view is power, whether power can then be used in a way that the powerful can exclude the powerless. And certainly even in cases of uses of water, this recent floods in Pakistan, people were saying that the powerful were able to keep the waters for themselves, and this was having very adverse impacts on the less powerful. So law has a means of limiting power, limiting arbitrariness. And that's why the rule of law is so important in the economic sphere. For sustainable development is something which would ensure intergenerational fairness, so that our generation doesn't consume disproportionately more, so that future generations are not deprived. So these notions of fairness need to be reflected now, both in the making of law, in the application of law, in the making of policy. And although, you know, we are all for free economies, free market, but one of the lessons learned from this recent experience is that even free markets, where they have market failures and lapses, need to be regulated by proper regulation, not a heavy-handed regulation. I remember Professor Stiglitz saying, it's not regulation or no regulation, it must be sound regulation, not bureaucratic, heavy-handed regulation, but something which requires expertise and understanding. Again, I can see The Hague has great importance. You have strength in financial institutions and financial matters. And so creative inputs can now be expected from a multidisciplinary institute set in The Hague, drawing upon all the intellectual and professional resources of Europe and, you know, North America and everywhere else. Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely the right moment.
Global regulations, global laws drawn up by a world community, in a way. I know you speak many languages, but I don't think you speak Dutch. But behind us, the last part, I think it's the 1813 Constitution. It says, well, to have any right here, one should be Dutch. And I was just thinking, what we're talking about very much here is the need for human rights and solutions, also drawn up in the world context. And I think Professor van Vollenhoven referred to earlier, who spent half of his career working on traditional customary systems in Indonesia, and the other half arguing for the importance of international law, I think symbolizes the exchange of knowledge needed for that. As a final question, I would like to ask all our panelists, where should we be with this institute and hopefully also with the world in 2020? 2020? What should the aim in terms of truly working on global justice, going from war crimes being an illusion to a helicopter in The Hague? What are the new helicopters to land in 2020? Let me ask Professor Fresco first.
Well, I wouldn't dare to say anything about war tribunals, but what I do think is that probably the most important challenge is to provide a legal framework for making sure we use our world's resources in the best possible way, in the best way to meet the needs of all, in a fair way indeed. And the real question, I think, which is not resolved in my view, is to what extent we need legal frameworks, to what extent we can use other existing frameworks, and how the balance between the two is. Because I know from experience, just getting some of these treaties negotiated, and I mean, Kyoto is a case in point, may be an extremely lengthy process. And so the real question, I was very glad my panelists brought up the issue of the markets and market regulation. There are a couple of things that maybe we can do within a broad general framework where we only need the legal framework to make sure we correct the imperfections. And that balance between what needs to be a legal framework, or put differently, to what extent justice is far broader than just legal, and how it relates to the different resources of our earth is very important. Because, to give you just one example, water...
Well, let me just with an eye on, because I see this as the beginning of a conversation that will continue in the coming years. I'm looking at the time, and I have been prompted to be prompted. But I wouldn't like to miss the occasion to just in one final sentence have Dr. Hossain and your vision for 2020.
Well, I think for 2020 we should be setting our priorities in those areas where I think ending poverty to the extent possible, securing food security, and then, of course, energy, I suppose, in that kind of order.
Yeah, natural resources. Well, and we have just learned that these dreams sometimes do not stay dreams, but really become realities through sustained efforts. Dr. Albright.
Well, I think that what the Institute has to do is to do two things that seem contradictory. One is to create a framework that has some legitimacy and continuity, and at the same time maintain enough flexibility to be able to deal with the problems of 2020, which frankly I don't think we know what they will be. And that is the hardest part, is that everything is moving at such warp speed. You know, some of us think we're really advanced now because we're talking about water. It's probably something else. And the bottom line is to try to figure out how we integrate the knowledge that comes from people that know how to operate a system, but also understand how many more players there are in all of this. 8 billion people with different historical backgrounds and culture who have as much right to be heard as anybody else. And so I think the Institute has to have a framework of action, but flexibility and imagination and innovation, that those things all have to go together.
Well, thank you very much for these wise words. Thank you, the panelists, for setting out not only the agenda, but I think also the need for the Institute here in The Hague with its interdisciplinary agenda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.